from a gross, the basic standpoint, the technology exists to exploit geothermal energy really effectively at places where we have high thermal gradients in the subsurface. So the geysers in California and Yellowstone National Park, for example, all where we have, hot spots of, say volcanic, magmatic activity closer to the surface. We've hot material closer to the surface. And we've got plenty of those options in Utah. But right now, coal-fired power is cheaper than exploiting that. That's why it's not, until subsidies or other motivations are put in place, it probably won't happen. Now, that said, recently a company, do you remember the name of the company that just put in Razor Technologies, put in a power plant that I'm told, and it's off the record, I'm told it's kind of a one-to-one. They've basically been creating as much energy dollar-wise as they've been spending. I don't know if that's true. I'm just basing that on what I've read in the newspaper, not on any scientific data. So Razor's attempt, as I understand it, was an attempt to move it beyond just the hot spots. And right now it's a one-to-one cost ratio. That's the little bit of information that I know. I started off my graduate studies, I started off in geothermal. That's why I came to the University of Utah to study, did my graduate work here to come work with David Chapman, who is one of the world's, in the 80s, one of the foremost geothermal researchers. And he studied Roosevelt and Escalante and all those geothermal areas, which are exploited for local purposes quite effectively. But for broad-scale power, you can't beat the cost of coal right now.
See, one more thing. My understanding is that the main obstacle, the main cost of geothermal is you have to put in very expensive drill holes, and only after you have them in there, you know whether they are really at a good spot. So in the 70s, they had something called cost-shared drilling, where industry, federal government, and state government shared the cost of the drill holes, and the condition for this was that all the results of that drilling had to be made publicly available. And some people are telling me from the USGS that this is basically what all the geothermal resources which we are using right now come from that program. So a program like this, and nobody knows about it anymore. I think programs like this should be promoted in order to promote geothermal, because it is really amazingly cheap. Yeah, there is this plant at Milford. There was the main engineer of the Milford plant was testifying before the Blue Ribbon Committee for Climate Change. And he said, oh, it's so complicated, and so many things can go wrong, and the brine, it's going to calcify, and everything like this. And other people said, well, if you have a coal-fired power plant, you also have these challenges, and these challenges can be overcome. And then he was asked what the cost of it was, and he said something like 8 cents per kilowatt hour, which I think is not that bad. So it's like almost like wind, but it's a steady source of energy. So I think geothermal is highly underrated and should be much more promoted. And here in Utah, we are lucky that we are in a part of the globe where those hot areas are close to the surface, much better than in the east of the United States. So I think geothermal is one of our playing cards, which we should play much more. Yeah.
Look up the MIT report.
So I'm an environmental technician, and In the way that it was presented, the initial regulations, environmental regulations of the EPA, basically have resulted in today where manufacturing is pretty well regulated. Unfortunately, energy producers are, in my experience, generally either self-regulated or contract out those monitoring services to somebody like myself. And was put in a position where we wish to serve the client's needs best. In my opinion, based off of history, it seems like things such as CCS and other large technologies will also be self-regulated. And I really would support shifting that back to manufacturers instead of trusting somebody who's producing the power to do their own regulations.
You mean monitoring? I mean,
Monitoring.
because the EPA is regulating, but you're talking about the monitoring, right?
Yeah, basically anything to do with environmental compliance on the state level, federal, or municipal.
So conformance, compliance, okay.
And so I'm wondering what's going on in terms of regulation for all of these new large-scale technologies.
Smart grid and some of the other things you discussed, I don't know. On CCS, it's still wrapped up in the EPA, like I said, very much so. You want to comment on the other?
I have no experience. No,
When you put energy on a local scale like they've done with there are many municipal utilities that are citizen-owned. All of the accountability is put on the citizens, and they don't want to create waste in their own backyard. If they have an interest in keeping carbon dioxide production low, it's very viable instead of storing it underground and hoping that some technician like me won't stumble across the one area in the sand where all the carbon dioxide is blowing out, because you can't keep it underground.
Well, we're relying now on non-human sensors, and hopefully our resolution, the granularity of our sensor network is sufficient to catch that, hopefully.
That's interesting. In places
Yeah,
where
yeah,
I've monitored
Brian.
at the landfill, and every quarter somebody walks around the landfill with a sniffer, an instrument, and that is the regulation, as opposed to setting up a system, a very expensive system of sensors like you're proposing.
Well, the EPA is, as I mentioned, it's easier to get a permit to inject battery acid right now than it is to get a permit to inject CO2. And part of that is, there's fighting. I don't know if it's infighting or what, but there's a lot of discussion about the proposed rules of 50 years of post-injection monitoring, and the resolution of the monitoring technologies. Is, some folks are arguing that it's too onerous, and I'm not one of them. Ultimately, it's the technology companies that end up making the money off of that, because it is expensive technology.
And then the corporation dissolves in the accountability as well.
Yeah, so it's
Okay,
I'm curious
thank you.
How well those sensors do it, stopping an earthquake?
I have a question. When you see, when people